Next, members of New Zealand's Parliament debating legislation that would ban most semi-automatic weapons, following the terrorist attack at a mosque in Christchurch. In this portion, Police Minister Stuart Nash introduced the amendment to the bill, telling members that owning a firearm is a privilege and not a right in New Zealand, and that law-abiding hunters and farmers would not be affected by this change. A portion of the debate is spoken in Maori, a native language and New Zealand's second official language. This is 40 Minutes.
Pursuant to leave previously given to the House, I call the Honourable Stuart Nash.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Arms Prohibited Firearms Magazines Parts Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Finance and Expenditure Committee to consider the bill. At the appropriate time, I intend to move that the bill be reported to the House by Monday, the 8th of April 2019, and that the committee have authority to meet at any time while the House is sitting, except during oral questions, during any evening on a day which there has been a sitting of the House, and on a Friday in a week where there has been a sitting of the House, and outside the Wellington area despite Standing Orders 191, 193, 194, 1B and C. Mr Speaker, as we meet today, New Zealand is under a terror threat level of high. As we meet today, police are routinely carrying firearms, Bushmaster rifles and Glock pistols in a significant departure from normal practice. As we meet today, mosques around the country require heightened security measures and a visible police presence to ensure the safety of worshippers. As we meet today, the largest criminal investigation in New Zealand history is underway. Dozens of specialist police investigators, supported by Australian federal and state police, are following up concerns about a number of high-risk individuals. As we meet today, a number of people are before the courts for trying to promote hateful publications and videos of death, for unlawfully possessing weapons, for making threats against our citizens, and, Mr Speaker, for murder. Mr Speaker, as we meet today, we are driven by one objective. We are driven by the need to ensure public safety is as strong as it can be. We are also driven by the memory of 50 men, women and children who were taken from their loved ones on the 15th of March. Their memory is our responsibility. We don't ever want to see an attack like this in our country again. We are compelled to act quickly. The Prime Minister announced the morning after the attacks that gun laws must change. That now falls on us as individual MPs and the whole Parliament. I am grateful for the support of colleagues from across the chamber because the attacks in Christchurch exposed a considerable weakness in our current firearms law. The most critical weakness in our firearms law is that too many people have legal access to too many semi-automatic firearms capable of causing significant harm. The current Arms Act has a legal definition for military-style semi-automatics, or MSSAs as they are called, that is easily circumvented and is difficult in practice to apply. There are 7,500 firearms licence holders who between them possess approximately 14,000 MSSA firearms. Many more have semi-automatic firearms in a so-called sporting configuration and are easily converted into an MSSA. Far too many people in this country have access to these dangerous firearms for no legitimate purpose, but at significant risk to the public. However, more broadly than this, too many people have legal access to the parts and magazines that, in a single change, can easily convert a semi-automatic firearm into a lethal MSSA, which then has the capacity to kill many people very quickly. So today we are debating legislation that will substantially tighten the current open and easy access to semi-automatic firearms to make our country a safer place. Our current firearms legislation came into force 35 years ago. It dates from the 1980s, a time when New Zealand was more isolated from the rest of the world. There were strong import controls, no internet marketplace or social media. Since this time, firearms technology has shifted. The weapons market has become global, and there is significant online community and trading environment. To bring firearms legislation more up to date and to substantially reduce loopholes and risk, major change is needed. This bill takes the first steps to modernise the Act. It will restrict access to the number of assault rifles and MSSAs, associated parts and large capacity magazines. We want to remove firearms that are capable of causing the death and devastation we witnessed on the 15th of March. We are also banning parts of a prohibited firearm or any part that can enable a weapon to be fired as a semi-automatic or fully automatic firearm. It is important to reiterate the legislation is not directed at law-abiding firearms owners who have legitimate uses for their guns. Our actions instead are directed at making sure March the 15th never happens again. Semi-automatic firearms, which are commonly used for hunting, pest control, stock management on farms and duck shooting, will not be affected. People can still use a .22 calibre rifle with a maximum 10-round magazine and a semi-automatic and pump-action shotgun with a maximum 5-round magazine. These firearms are widely and safely used amongst our farming and hunting communities. Indeed, today the Game Animal Council has confirmed that recreational and commercial hunting of large game animals such as deer, pig, tahr will largely be unaffected. MSSAs and assault rifles are not needed for hunting or stock management. There will be a small number of tightly controlled exemptions for professional animal cullers and licensed firearms dealers. Those groups or individuals identified as management agencies under Section 100 of the Biosecurity Act can apply to the Commissioner of Police for a permit to possess a prohibited firearm. This will include the sort of pest control work undertaken by contractors for the Department of Conservation or a local council. Those applying will need to demonstrate that they will only use the firearm for that purpose stated and must demonstrate that they cannot do the work with any other firearm. I already know that federated farmers and professional animal control groups would like to ensure this applies to pest control on private land, and the Select Committee will take advice on this. While these types of semi-automatics do not present the same level of risk to the public as MSSAs, nevertheless, they can cause harm. We have already signalled that we will be doing further work on strengthening the Arms Act in a future amendment bill, including the criteria around who can get a firearms licence. The bill also proposes an exemption for bona fide collectors, including museums and for film and theatre companies. They must take steps to disable the weapon and follow other guidelines around security and safety, and including storage. Mr. Speaker, the exemptions I have described come with considerable checks and balances around them. Let us be clear, owning a firearm is a privilege, not a right, in this country. We need to remove the most dangerous weapons from our communities. The bill proposes the introduction of a number of new offences. This includes possessing, using, presenting, supplying, selling, manufacturing and assembling a banned firearm. The offences attract penalties ranging from up to 3 years imprisonment to 10 years imprisonment, depending on the nature and seriousness of the offence. We know this law change will have an impact on law-abiding firearms licence holders. That's why we have confirmed details of the amnesty and are working on a fair and reasonable compensation through a buyback scheme. There are good people in all of our communities who will find themselves in possession of banned firearms, parts and magazines. This is because we are changing the law, not because these people have done anything wrong. Given this, the government is putting an amnesty in place. This will allow people to let the police know if they are in possession of a newly banned firearm, part or magazine. The amnesty also means that other firearm parts and magazines and ammunition not affected by the ban can also be handed over. Police are already working with the New Zealand Defence Force around storage and transport and safe destruction of these weapons. The government recognises that people have invested money in these firearms. Running alongside the amnesty, the government will implement a buyback scheme for the newly banned firearms, which are surrendered. Mr. Speaker, the primary role of government is to ensure the safety and well-being of its citizens and to allow them the ability to go about their lives free from harm and free from the fear of harm. The Select Committee process will be used to ensure we've got the balance right between the legitimate use of firearms and tightening gun laws to improve the safety and security of all New Zealanders. Just before I close, I want to pay tribute to the brave and compassionate and dedicated women and men of the New Zealand Police Service. Over the past few weeks, they have shown our country why we have one of the best police services in the world. Our thoughts remain with our Muslim communities and the people of Christchurch. We are doing this for them. We are doing this for our future generations. It is our responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Chris Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin my contribution to the debate and the National Party's contribution to this debate by starting off where the Minister finished, which is by paying tribute to the hard-working men and women of the New Zealand Police Force. As the Minister has commented very appropriately, we have seen the best of the police in the last 2 weeks. We have seen their swift action on the afternoon of Friday, March 15, and the apprehension of the suspect involved. And we have seen police out and about in the community in a way that New Zealanders have come to expect, but is no less noteworthy for that. We have seen them armed, and that has shocked many people, but we have seen them engaging at our mosques and at our various vigils and memorial services, in our parks and our schools, outside our parliament. And they have done a superb job, as I know they will continue to do. So I'd like to start by echoing the words of the Minister. Mr. Speaker, the last 2 weeks for New Zealand, or 2 and a bit weeks, have been about grieving and have been about mourning. And now the Parliament has to turn its attention to the legislative response to the events of Friday, March 15, and the first phase is firearms law reform. And as the National Party leader and leader of the opposition, Simon Bridges, has said, the National Party intends to be constructive and work with the government to make sure that we get this legislation into place quickly, but also make sure we get the legislation right. Phase 2 and 3 and 4 will be about social media, about hate speech and hate activity, and I think New Zealanders are going to have an inevitable debate about the balance between security and privacy, the balance between free speech and hate speech, and about some of the activities that led up to Friday, March 15. But for now, Mr. Speaker, we are talking about firearms. Mr. Speaker, the public has made it very clear over the last 2 weeks that they expect the Parliament to act. They have made it very clear, in my mind, that the time has come for quite substantial reform of our firearms regime. Parliament, therefore, has an obligation and a duty to act, and today we start that process. That's the first point I want to make, is that Parliament hears the call of the public that they expect action. It was very humbling for me to stand on behalf of the National Party and accept a petition run through Action Station alongside Grant Robertson and James Shaw of the Green Party, calling for a ban on semi-automatics and military-style semi-automatics. That petition, oh, sorry, Louisa, and you, I should say, Ms Wall, that petition numbered some, from memory, 40,000 plus people collected in only a matter of days, which I think gives you a sense of the public mood around this issue. So that's the first point I want to make, sir, is that Parliament has heard those messages. We will act. The second point I want to make, sir, is that I think this bill strikes an appropriate balance, as the Minister has said, between protecting legitimate, law-abiding, licensed firearm owners, our hunters, our shooters, those in our farming community, and whilst also making sure that the public don't have access to things like military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. And the harm from those, sir, is the sheer lethality that exists within them, that the Minister has rightly pointed out. And I think it is appropriate that small calibre rimfire semi-autos and lesser capacity shotguns are excluded from the prohibition that the Minister is advancing in the legislation. A third point I want to make, sir, is to say that I think the general exclusions from the new prohibitions are also appropriate. Many members of the House will have been contacted by collectors in the last few days, and I see there is an exemption which we'll explore properly in the Select Committee for bona fide collectors of historical antique weapons from the past. We would not want to give up that history as a result of this legislation, and nor should we. I see there are also exemptions in the regime for museums as well, and we're going to explore the precise balance of those at the Select Committee in the short amount of time that we have. Sir, I believe even the licensed firearm community, some of whom members will be aware of their email inboxes filling up, I believe even those opposed to some of the measures in the legislation will welcome the new penalties, but also the strengthening of the existing penalties as well. This is something that many people have been calling for a long time as part of a general update to the Arms Act 1983, which, as the Minister rightly notes, is now very out of date. And the new penalty regime, I think, will be widely welcomed by many people in the community. For those who are licensed and legitimate firearm owners who store them safely and store them in the correct way, use them in the correct way, and would never dream of committing a crime, it does bug and grate on them when they see people abusing firearms or not storing them properly or not complying with the terms of their various endorsements or licences. It does grate when those penalties are not enforced, and I know that members of the community will welcome those. That's the fourth point I wanted to make, sir. Finally, I want to cover, fifthly, the amnesty and the buyback regime. We do welcome this. I'm interested in exploring in the Select Committee exactly how expensive it will be. There seems to be a range of estimates on the table, anywhere from $100 million to $200 million, all the way up to $300 million that the Deputy Prime Minister, Right Honourable Winston Peters, has mentioned recently. I'm aware of some estimates out there that it could be up to $1 billion to buy back the various weapons. I urge the government to move expeditiously on the details of the buyback regime. Many members of the community are awaiting those details, and I think it would be good grace and acting in good faith to provide those details as quickly as possible. I acknowledge it takes time to work out the details. We in the National Party stand ready to work with the government on those details, but we do need to know exactly how it will work. I want to put on the record now that there needs to be an answer to how dealers will be dealt with through the buyback regime. I have seen some comments from the Minister that they will not be touched, that they will not be part of the buyback regime. There are licensed firearm dealers out there in the community, some of whom have large amounts of stock, thousands of dollars, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars worth of stock that they have brought into the country in good faith to sell. Once this legislation passes, they will be unable to do that. There may be circumstances in which they're unable to return that to their particular supplier. They will be out of pocket through no fault of their own, and we will need to work that through, and I'm just encouraging the Minister to work that through with us, as well as working it through the Select Committee. This is a substantial piece of legislation. The devil, as I've commented publicly, the devil is in the detail when it comes to firearms law. I'm aware of some comments from the community already about the misapplication of a variety of definitions. The wording may not be right, but we have some time over the next week or so in the Select Committee to really get down to the nuts and bolts of this legislation. We will work in good faith with the government to make sure that we reform the law properly and get it as good as we possibly can. Madam Speaker, I should say, Parliament is now turning its mind away from grief and mourning towards a proper legislative response to the horrific events of March 15. We in the National Party are looking forward to working with the government to making sure our response when it comes to firearms is fit for purpose and right, and we will engage in good faith with them as we continue to do that. Thank you.
I call the Honourable Kelvin Davis.
Tēnā koe, Madam Speaker. Tuatahi māku e tautukongi ana ngā kupu o te raunga memara ko te pihopa wana kupu e mea ana mō ngā wiki e rua ko pāhore ake nei ko tangi te motu. Engari, ko tae te wā kia puta i te ao pauri ki roto i te ao marama kia tāhuri hia ai o mātou hiringaro kia whakapakri ai ngā ture e pāna ki ngā pū. Kia kore anō tēnei āhuatanga e pāmai kia tātou ki roto Aotearoa. So, Madam Speaker, I'd just like to acknowledge the words of the Honourable Member Chris Bishop, who said although we've been in a period of mourning and we still do mourn for those who lost their lives in the events of the 15th of March, it is time for us to turn our attention now to strengthening these laws, the legislation, so that we never have this sort of event occur again here in New Zealand. So I'm proud to stand and support this bill, the Arms Prohibited Firearms, Magazines and Parts Amendment Bill. And proud to support the government and dare I say the whole Parliament that's taking action in response to the March 15th terrorist attack, so that we do protect all New Zealanders and keep us all safe. And can I just acknowledge my colleague, the Honourable Stuart Nash. I know that within about 36 hours of the attack, he had already turned his attention to law changes that needed to be made in this regard. And I'd just like to also acknowledge his words and our gratitude to the New Zealand Police Force for the sterling job they did on that day and subsequently since then. He also made the comment that the reason we're doing this is that public safety needs to be as strong as it can be. So I'd just like to acknowledge Stuart Nash. So, Madam Speaker, in the aftermath of the Christchurch terror attack, New Zealanders were asking ourselves many difficult questions, such as why has this happened in Aotearoa? How can we help the victims? How can we heal as a nation? And are we safe? New Zealanders around the country have come together to express our grief and to show our solidarity with the Muslim community. We have united to reject the hateful ideology that inspired this attack, and we have begun the long journey of healing. We're strongly affirming our values of compassion and tolerance and manaakitanga, and it's crucial. It's a crucial way we can make sure New Zealand is safe for everyone. Madam Speaker, the government is taking every action to ensure the safety of New Zealanders. We've agreed to hold a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Christchurch attack. We need to get to the bottom of how the terrorist was able to do what he did and understand what we need to do to make sure it never reoccurs. We've been asking tough questions about the role social media has played in the attacks, and we know New Zealand will be a leading part of the global conversation on stopping the spread of hate on social media. We have maintained a high level of vigilance in the aftermath of the attack. Our threat alert level remains high, meaning that the police and security services will provide extra protection at the border and in public places. And, Madam Speaker, a crucially important way to protect New Zealand is to make sure we have safe and effective gun laws. That's why, 6 days after the attack, the government announced the ban on military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. We need gun reform now. Any move to slow down the process is a move to stop it. And that is the same rhetoric used overseas to stop gun law changes. For example, the NRA, the American organisation, the NRA, it's straight out of their playbook. They claim the legislation is being rushed, and they throw out mistruths, they muddy the waters, they create anger and confusion. If we don't act now, how many further attacks will we tolerate in this country before we will do something? Or will we become like the United States, where deaths through use of guns occur so often that they almost really rate a mention now?
I hope the member is not reading his speech. He's an experienced member and he knows that he doesn't read the speeches.
Okay, so Madam Speaker, so we are banning all military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles that are designed to kill people to make our country a safer place. Madam Speaker, there is no reason for us to have military-style semi-automatics here in New Zealand. So I don't mind doing a bit of deer shooting, Madam Speaker. Deer shooting, pig hunting, shooting tahr, they can all be achieved through bolt-action rifles. We don't need semi-automatics to do it. In fact, there's very little point of a semi-automatic. If you fire at a deer and you miss it, it disappears, and you'd have to be spraying bullets around in a pretty outrageous way, and even then, the chances are you hitting one are pretty slim. So, Madam Speaker, the legislation is not directed at the vast bulk of law-abiding gun owners, especially those in rural communities who use 22s and shotguns with limited ammunition capacity for farm work and hunting. And this move is widely supported. It's got the full support of the government parties, New Zealand First, the Greens. It's also got the support of the National Party, Federated Farmers, Fish and Game, Trade Me, Hunting and Fishing and others have all come out in support of the ban. And that's because, as I've said, we all know that in order to hunt deer or tahr or pigs, you don't need military-style semi-automatics. So, Madam Speaker, it's also no secret that I handed in my own gun to the police. I think it was the Tuesday after the attack. I had a 22 calibre semi-automatic rifle with a 15-round magazine. I had no qualms about handing it in, Madam Speaker. I used it to shoot pests when I lived out in the rural areas. I haven't had much chance to use it since I've been in Parliament. The reality is, Madam Speaker, when I'm no longer in Parliament and I feel the need to go and shoot the possum in the apple tree in the orchard, I'll just go and buy another 22 bolt action and I can achieve the same thing. There is a joke in the family that the largest thing I've ever shot is a tree. I was aiming for the possum, but it says more about me than the gun, Madam Speaker. The point is the safety of New Zealanders is more important than my need or my right to own a semi-automatic 22 with the magazine of the capacity that I explained. So we want to reiterate that our actions are directed at making sure that this act of terror never happens again. We strongly believe that the vast majority of legitimate gun owners in New Zealand will understand that these moves are in the national interest, and most people will take these changes in their stride, just as they did in Australia when they made similar changes some years ago. So no one is being criminalised overnight. In fact, Madam Speaker, an amnesty will be put in place for weapons, and in fact those people who currently have illegal weapons, they can hand those in under the current amnesty. They will not be criminalised for handing those in. This is actually an opportunity for those law-abiding New Zealanders to actually go and hand the guns in. Those guns that are illegal, that will become illegal, just go and hand them in. This is what we can do to make New Zealand a much safer place. So our focus is getting these guns out of the community. And like I say, I was a gun owner. Well, I still am a gun owner. I know I've got a slug gun left in my in the safe now. Madam Speaker, we need to get these out of the community, and we will work with owners to make sure that that does happen in an orderly way. So there will be a fair buyback scheme, Madam Speaker. We're committed to that. The exact details are still being worked through, but it will be similar to the Australian scheme that they implemented, and people did receive a fair price for the guns that they handed in. We can't say with certainty the cost of the buyback, what the cost of the buyback will be. It will be somewhere between $150 to $300 million. We're not exactly sure. But then again, Madam Speaker, what's the cost of an event like we saw on the 15th of March? The public will have a say. We encourage them to submit to the Select Committee. The Select Committee will be meeting over the next week. We're open to hearing the technical issues. We're open to hearing that the legislation gets finessed and gets made right. But this is the first tranche of changes, Madam Speaker. There will be more legislation to come. So I commend this legislation to the House, and I just again would like to express my condolences to all those who perished.
I call the Honourable Amy Adams.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to join too in speaking in support of this arms amendment legislation and join with other members of the House in both recording our thanks to the New Zealand Police and also our condolences to all of the victims and their families. Madam Speaker, when I spoke in this House on the condolence motion in Wednesday of the week following the attack, I said there were two questions that really continued to occupy our thinking. One was, how did this happen? And the second was, how do we stop it happening again? And this bill is very much around the second of those questions, how we stop an event like this of the scale and the tragedy on the scale happening again. I think it's fair to say that over the last 18 days, in the wake of the Christchurch terrorist attack, a lot of us have learnt so much more around gun rules in New Zealand, what is possible, what is practical, what is legal, what can be done quite easily. And one of the things that we have learnt in the most awful of ways, Madam Speaker, is the utter and devastating lethality of these fast-firing, self-loading weapons. The ability of the gunman to go into Al Noor Mosque and in a matter of just a small number of minutes shoot more than 70 people before getting in his car and heading off to attack the Linwood Mosque tells us so much about the damage that can be done by any gun, admittedly, but by these military-style semi-automatics and semi-automatics that can be amended, adapted, loaded to create such devastating strike force. And, Madam Speaker, when we started to, those of us who hadn't previously been deeply involved in gun legislation, when we started to understand the, I would say, failings in the current law that came about after Aramoana and the way they were eventually amended before being passed into law, we see that there are so many gaps and deficiencies that allow a person with a Category A gun licence, so that's a normal garden variety gun licence, to buy a weapon without any of the oversight and checks that would go with the Category E licence, to buy equally lawfully high-capacity magazines and the like, and yet put them together in a way that creates a gun that frankly has no place on the streets of New Zealand and can cause the damages that it's caused. Now, knowing that, Madam Speaker, no one in this House can ever now unknow those problems, and none of us can sit here, I believe, and continue to allow the sales of the weaponry, of the capacity and the ability that can be created from it with the system we currently have. I want to just take a moment to reflect on one of the challenges that is raised a lot, which is that, well, that's fine, you're going to make it tougher for law-abiding gun owners, but you'll never do anything about their legal guns in society. And to a point, that may well be true. There will continue to be illegal and illegally owned guns, I'm sure, but it doesn't in any way lessen the requirement and the obligation on us and on this House to ensure that our gun laws are fit for purpose. And so we may not be able to guarantee that no gun will ever be used in a way that hurts someone or that every gun will be lawful, but we can absolutely make sure that our gun laws require a standard of care of our police and of our gun dealers and our gun owners that we expect. And that's certainly what this legislation sets out to do. Now, I do obviously have some concerns that as we're taking it through in a very truncated period of time, there isn't going to be the ability to, as the last speaker commented, finesse the law in the way a select committee normally would. However, I think the circumstances and the urgency that we're facing means that in this case we should nonetheless proceed with what has been well-signalled changes to the gun legislation and then take our time to return back to the issue in a more fulsome way as required. There's one final point I do want to also put on record, which is simply in relation to the timing of what we know about the buyback scheme that the government has said they will offer, and the legislation which they intend to pass in approximately a week from now. Now, the government has said repeatedly, and I thank them for their assurance, it's certainly the right thing to do, that there will be a fair buyback scheme operating to properly compensate gun owners in a way that's similar to the ones we saw in Australia. And all of that is good. But, Madam Speaker, I've got to say I'm far less concerned about what the total ultimate cost of that will be, because I accept what the government's saying, that it's almost impossible to know. What I'm far more interested in, though, is a bit more clarity from them on how that buyback scheme will work so that the gun owners that we are about to deprive of their lawfully held possessions, and in a way I support, how they are going to be compensated, when, under what schedule, what they can expect. I don't like, as a matter of practice, passing legislation and saying, and don't worry, we'll compensate you for that, but we'll tell you what the compensation looks like later. I think the public of New Zealand deserve to know a little bit more about how that will work, and frankly this House should know more about it as part of passing the legislation. So to me that piece is the piece that's far more, there are far more questions to be answered sooner from the government. The total bill will be what the total bill is. But, Madam Speaker, I certainly hope that before next Tuesday, when the legislation is passed by this House, the government sees its way clear to give us more information on that. But, Madam Speaker, coming back to where I started, we will never be the same as we were before 140-odd on the 15th of March. And as a result of that, New Zealand expects and demands, and I think rightly so, that this Parliament acts quickly and thoroughly to address what are now very clear deficiencies in our gun legislation. And for that reason, Madam Speaker, I'm proud to support the bill.
I call Mark Patterson.
Madam Speaker, I rise to confirm New Zealand First's support for this arms amendment bill. As our leader, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, said at the time, at 1:30 p.m. on the 15th of March, our world changed forever, and so will our gun laws. Was he awake for that? The gravity of this situation is not lost on anyone in this House. The murder of 50 of our citizens in cold blood. But the reality of that is this gunman was operating legitimately on an A-class gun licence, bought with a military-style semi-automatic weapon, legitimately purchased through a retail outlet. Quite frankly, he has exposed the gaping holes in our legislation. The system has been found wanting. We have not learnt the lessons of Aramoana and the lessons, frankly, from the likes of Port Arthur and other international incidents. We have been naive and we have paid the price. We have failed to act, and I think we've all acknowledged that. But I would also acknowledge that we have acknowledged that, and that across parties we are looking to act decisively to remediate that situation. Of course, this is the first part of the response, dealing with the availability of these military-style semi-automatic weapons, and it's required. We need to give the public some semblance of safety and decisiveness of action. by taking these weapons out of circulation as soon as practically possible. And it also is required to give certainty to the users of these weapons, the owners, the dealers, etc., who need to know what the implications are for them. We note the buyback, and the figures have been bandied round, but it will cost what it costs. It's important that it is fair. Madam Speaker, these legitimate gun owners have, through no fault of their own, been caught up in this situation, and we must be fair to them. I trust that the Cabinet and Parliament will recommend that course of action. We also note that there will be, being the first part of this response, so there is much else to do. Of course, the Royal Commission that will come in behind this and look at things like a register of all firearms, police vetting, and how this individual was allowed to get a licence in the first place, and the holes in that system, and how we need to tighten that up around storage. And of course there is those wider social issues around freedom of speech, which we're all going to have to grapple with, and certainly in light of this new world that we find ourselves in social media, etc. New Zealand First has been strong supporters of recreational hunters and legitimate users, and we note likes of farmers legitimately need firearms to euthanase stock for pest control. And recreational hunters. That is something that we value in this country, the right to be able to go out and hunt for deer or tahr or whatever it might be. That is a legitimate use. And of course, there are quite some sizable businesses around this, tourism businesses and the like, and legitimate pest control businesses. So we have to move in terms of the certainty to give these people the certainty of what will be available to them, but also acknowledge that they are legitimate users, and where there needs to be exemptions, that we will look through the select committee process, as truncated as it might be, to make sure that, that their views are heard. But we do note the likes of Federated Farmers and the Game Animal Council have engaged willingly and supportively to date. And there is still .22 calibre, up to 10 shot mags and 5 shotguns, as the Honourable Kelvin Davis said, that still have legitimate or firepower that is capable of doing the roles that they could legitimately be expected to use. We note there is no exception at this point for international sport, and that's something that will have to be looked upon in the second tranche. And we do also encourage the penalty provisions. This is a serious buyback. This is not a voluntary situation. We are acting. We are acting decisively. We do need the penalties for not complying to be significant, and they will be. As Minister Nash said in his introduction of the bill, owning a firearm in this country is a privilege. It is not a right. We must strike the balance through legitimate use, but the actions that we are taking as a parliament, we are doing quite simply, Madam Speaker, because it is, in this circumstance, the right thing to do. So New Zealand First will be supporting this legislation and participating actively in the truncated select committee process. Thank you.